Hey guys. So today's topic is, are things getting better? So we're going to take a kind of a broad brush view of sort of how people are doing in the world as a whole over time, and whether the indicators of well-being are moving in the right direction or in the wrong direction. And a good place to start is with a web tool called Gapminder. It provides animated graphics. It's pretty cool, actually. And this particular chart we're going to use today um, looks at the relationship between income and life expectancy. So it sort of captures two important dimensions of well-being. One is economic well-being and material affluence, and the second is health, which is best measured by how long the average person can be expected to live in a given country at a given point in time. So what they've done here is represented each country in the world with a little bubble, these circles, and the circles are adjusted, in their size is adjusted according to the population of the country. So that big red, those two big red circles there are both China and India, since they're the most populous countries in the world. Um, and then you can see on the upper right here, world regions. So the Americas are green dots, the Africa is blue, Eurasia is, including Russia, is yellow, and then the rest of Asia and the Middle East are kind of reddish. So we can sort of track and see how the regional clusters change over time. Now, when I press this little arrow on the lower left-hand side, you're going to see these bubbles start to move around. And what'll happen here is that we're going to move from the year 1800 all the way up till close to the present. And you'll see bubbles moving upward, and in that case, that's life expectancy, which you'll see goes from 20 all the way up to 90 on the left, on the vertical axis, and then on the horizontal axis is income, which goes from a few $100s per year all the way up to $64,000 a year, average income per person. So um, before we put this in motion and see the changes in life expectancy and income over time, let's take note here that in the year 1800, all of the countries in the world were clustered in the lower left-hand corner, meaning that they had low life expectancy and low income. Now you'll notice that there was some diversity in income. The high-income countries had about $2,500 per person back in 1800, and then there were a lot of countries in between $500 and $1,000 per person, and a few countries that were below 500 per person. So there was some diversity there. There was a little bit less diversity in longevity. It basically ranged from around 25 years average life expectancy to in the upper 30s. So that range was, even the wealthiest countries did not have incomes that were, I mean, life expectancy that was much greater than the poorest countries. Um, there wasn't a whole lot of relationship there. So, but look, let's see what happens when we put this in motion. So, as the 19th century moves along, there's not a lot of movement initially, and then we notice that some countries, some bubbles to the right side, start moving up in life expectancy and moving out higher in income as well. Other countries still clustered over on the lower left. Then in the 20th century, you see a lot more movement as countries move more rapidly, both toward higher income and toward longer life expectancy. Notice that by the end of the um, time period, we have a lot more countries in the upper right hand corner or in the kind of middle, upper middle. And so very few countries, no countries really down in the lower left-hand corner anymore, meaning that all countries made gains in life expectancy, and most countries made big gains as well in income. Notice that even the poorest countries have life expectancies around 60 years old by 2019, um, and that the gap between the poorest countries and the richest in terms of life expectancy is significant, but again, it's not dramatic. It's between 60 years and about a little over 80 years. Um, so the movement is generally in the same direction, but some countries are moving up the income scale much faster than others, and there are still a significant number of countries, who are below. We said that the richest countries in 1800 were about $2,500 per income. Well, you see that there are not a lot, but there's still a significant number who are poorer than that even today. Most of those countries are blooming. They're countries in Africa. The countries that are wealthiest are the big green dot. That's the United States, and then the um, the yellow dots are Europe. They're among the wealthiest countries. And then notice there are a few wealthy Asian countries now as well. Now, one of the things that this allows us to do is to track certain countries over time. So we're going to track a few countries and see more clearly some comparisons here. We'll start with China. We'll track China. We'll track India. Move down here and click on India. And then we'll track the United States and the United Kingdom. So two, whoops, do we have these tracked or not? Yeah, I think we do. So let's start back down here. And so we have two big developing countries and two big currently rich countries. And you can see they start off, U.S. and Britain were wealthier than China and India at this period, but let's see how things change over time. Notice that China is kind of stuck here for a while. It moves up in income, but then it moves back down. Again, with India moving up now, not really changing a lot initially, whereas the U.S. and Great Britain have started their climb upward. It's a little obscured in the case of the U.S. there, but still, even by the end of the 19th century, not much improvement either in income or life expectancy in China and India. But you start to see the U.S. and Britain have moved up in income. Then we get into the 20th century. Finally, we start to see some upward movement, China and India, toward greater life expectancy. Still no improvement really in income, though. Notice that the U.S. and Great Britain, they improved in income without moving much upward in life expectancy. But then, starting about the beginning of the end of the 19th century, you start seeing a rise in life expectancy as well. So income rises first, life expectancy follows. In the case of China and India, it works the reverse. Notice that life expectancy is improving, but income is not. So, in the case of the early developers, income rose, followed by life expectancy, while income was still improving. Whereas in the late developing countries, China and India, you have improvements in life expectancy, and the rise in per capita incomes really don't start until the last few decades of the 20th century. And once they do, then growth is very fast and incomes rise quickly uh, at the same time that life expectancy kind of levels out at a much higher level. So, what does this tell us? It tells us that early developers got rich before they got healthy, and late developers got healthy before they got rich. Um, One of the factors that's really important here was the development of public health. Public health is not one-on-one doctor care, it's the health of populations. And so you develop the germ theory of disease, sanitation, modern sewage facilities, um, even personal hygiene, things like washing hands, um, keeping kitchens facilities clean, um, and then eventually antibiotics, improvements in air quality, um, other kinds of ways that public health improve people's lives. Inoculations, vaccines came along a bit later to get rid of some of the childhood diseases that have been big killers. So, starting in the late 19th, early 20th century, you had these innovations of public health innovations that were relatively cheap to spread to other parts of the world. And so countries that were even relatively poor were able to import these technologies, these organizational innovations in public health to improve the health even though their populations remained quite poor. Um, Now, that's actually great news because if countries had to wait to get wealthy before they could make their populations healthy, that would be pretty sad because many countries, as we saw, remain quite poor, and um, it will be a long time before their populations are wealthy, even if they manage to improve their growth rates. So, um, if you needed to wait until you get wealthy before you could get healthy, then you'd have a lot of people living in utter misery and living short, difficult lives. But since we're able to improve people's quality of life, their longevity, even if their income is quite modest, um, that allows for some real hopeful improvements in human welfare. Okay, let's go back to our PowerPoint and we'll look at some other indicators here. Um, let's look at for instance, um, war deaths. And we're looking at battle deaths per conflict since 1946. And this divides between conflicts between states in blue, civil conflicts that have foreign intervention in red, civil conflicts without foreign intervention, and then colonial conflicts. So we're not so much interested in the differences between these conflicts here, but the most important thing is that per conflict, the number of battle deaths has dramatically declined from the 50s up till the most recent figures. Most recent figures show that the number of battle deaths per conflict has declined dramatically. And if we looked at the number of conflicts, have also declined as well. So war has become less deadly and less common. What about poverty? This shows the number of people living in extreme poverty, less than, which the World Bank defines as less than $1.90 a day. You see here that there's been dramatic declines, especially in Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific. It's almost wiped out, extreme poverty. South Asia has declined, although there's still some significant, this is projecting in the future, by the way, as of 2015. Still significant, but much improved in South Asia. Africa is still the big continent with the biggest challenges in terms of absolute poverty. This shows a slightly different way of looking at this. The um, the yellow line is the proportion of the world's population living under $2 a day, which starting in the early 19th century was almost everybody. The red is the number living under $1 a day. Again, very over 80% at the beginning of the 19th century, falling to about 24% by the early 90s. Then we pick up with a measure of the using the World Bank standard, which is $1.90 a day, and here we see that declining all the way to under 10% by 2015. Now let's back up here and acknowledge a couple things. First of all, $1.90 a day is still very, very poor. The assumption that one can live a life of dignity on $1.90 a day is pretty heroic. We know that if we use the figure of $5.50 a day, then about half the world's population would still be under that level. So poverty is still widespread. And if we looked at the very current period, COVID has thrown the global economy into a major downturn, the worst really since the 1930s. And so at present, literally hundreds of millions of people who had eked out an existence above the poverty line have now fallen back into serious poverty. So now that hopefully will not be a lasting condition, but it shows how precarious these gains are to perturbations like the virus. Improved access to clean water. You can see the number of people with access has gone up, while the number without access to clean water has gone down. Education at the top here, it shows the share of the population enrolled in education, and you can see that almost each part of the world has seen improvements in overall the proportion of school-age children who are in school. The blue in the middle says global average. That's the global measure. And at the bottom is the global literacy rate, a percentage of the population, adult population, that can read and write. And we see that that's also gone up significantly from about 1900, about 21%, to over 80% today. What about gender equality? Well, there are a lot of different things we could look at. Certainly, gender equality has not been reached by in any part of the world or by any measure, but we can see some progress. I've chosen this particular. What about representation in political systems? This looks at the proportion of seats held by women in national parliaments in 1990 compared to 2017. The darker blue shades mean higher female representation. So comparing just an eyeballing the figure on the left, the map on the left, comparing it to the map on the right, we see growing female participation. At the same time, there are quite varied perceptions. If we look if we survey people and ask, what are your perceptions about changes in global extreme poverty? Do you perceive poverty as growing or as declining or staying the same? And if we look at this chart, it shows that the green are, first of all, we have various countries on the left-hand, on the vertical axis. And for each country, it shows the proportion who believe that poverty has fallen in green, the proportion who believe poverty has increased in kind of pink, and then the yellowish color in the middle is those who think poverty's remained the same. Well, if we just look at those who think poverty has decreased, we can see that those figures nowhere exceed half. The highest is in China, which is a little hard to read here, but I think it's 47% believe poverty's decreased on a global basis. And then you get down to countries like Japan, who very few people perceive that global poverty has declined, even though, as we've seen, that is in fact the case. Poverty has decreased significantly. But in most countries, the majority, if we take average of all the countries, it's 52% believe poverty has increased, and only 20% believe that it has fallen. Interesting that the places where people are perceived poverty to have fallen the most are some of the poor countries: China, Kenya, Peru, India, Senegal, Indonesia. On the other hand, the wealthier countries, Japan, Italy, Hungary, France, Argentina, Spain, those are countries where people are more pessimistic and think poverty has actually increased the most. So first, the big picture is that the overall perception is that poverty has increased when in fact the exact opposite is true, and that it's in wealthier countries that people have seen cling most to the idea that poverty's increased. If you think about it, a country like China, for instance, in people's lifetimes, they have seen dramatic improvements in income and in welfare. Just stunning. In 1979, the average income was $350 per person. Today, it's somewhere around $9,000 or $10,000 per person. So that's a huge increase in a fairly short period of time. Whereas in a country like Japan, it's been in relative stagnation. Same thing for Italy since really the 1990s. So I haven't seen much improvement. What about optimism about the future? Well, overall, across all the countries surveyed, 35% said living conditions will get better in the coming years. 29% said that living conditions will get worse. 27% say they'll remain the same. So only about a little over a third really believe things are getting better. But notice again, the countries that are most optimistic: Kenya, Nigeria, India, Senegal, China, Indonesia, Peru. These are countries that have fairly low incomes. They are optimistic that things will get better over time. Japan, France, Belgium, Italy, Hungary, the wealthier countries think that things are not going to get better, that they're kind of past their peak in welfare. This is another survey of, do you think the world's getting better or worse? And it gives very similar kinds of results. Notice that the United States is relatively pessimistic. Only 6% believe that the world's getting better. Now, why is this? Why is this pessimism? Well, one of the problems is that the media has a bias toward bad news, and it's really quite stunning. This was a study which looked at the tone of news coverage, the percentage of news reports that were coded as positive or negative in tone. You can see among U.S. news outlets, the vast majority of the news outlets, had very high levels of negative news coverage, whereas very small amount of positive. Interestingly, Fox News was the most positive. I think that's because this survey was done during the Trump presidency. If it had been surveyed during the Obama presidency, probably Fox would have more bad news, frankly, given their political bias. European news outlets are pretty much a similar kind of picture. So, why is it then that news outlets have a bias toward bad news? Well, the preferences of audience members create incentives for the media to focus on bad news. They want to get as many eyes on their news coverage as possible, whether it's television or print or some other medium. And so they try to give people the kind of news coverage that they're most likely to pay attention to. Well, one study found that people said that they preferred to read or watch good news, but in fact, when presented with both bad and good news headlines, they spent more time on bad news headlines. One Russian news site published only good news for an entire day, and their traffic fell off by 2/3. Um, and I think there's a psychological reason for this, and that is that evolution has given us a adapted us to pay more attention to immediate threats than to long-term incremental progress. So things that change slowly, even if they're for the better, don't really grab our attention. But threats, bad news that, especially terrible weather events or natural disasters or war or famine, things that feel threatening to our well-being or those of others, grab our attention because, from an evolutionary standpoint, that's how you survive, is you pay attention to threats. Um, Now, given that most of the actual, contrary to perceptions, that there's actually been a lot of good news, things are on the whole getting better. How do we explain that? Well, there are a number of ideas that have been put forward. Some arguments focus on ideas and knowledge. The idea of the Enlightenment, the movement of people toward rationality as a way of getting a better grasp on reality and understanding our world in greater depth, which allows us to solve problems more successfully. Um, the convergence, the idea of cultural convergence, that cultures are much more in contact with one another, and even though we may perceive conflict at the same time, some argue that, in fact, cultures borrow from one another at a much higher rate than ever before, leading to a decline in major differences across cultures. Um, Democratization, the spread of democracy as a way of managing government and politics, is seen by some as a prerequisite for a more peaceful world and a more um, uh, less violent ways of managing conflict and solving problems. There are also material factors. Um, Here, there are the techno optimists who see technology as a major factor in the improvement of the human condition and believe that humans have the ingenuity to come up with, um, and science as a way of coming up with new technologies that solve problems for us. Economists focus on abundance and our ability, even where certain natural resources may be finite, that as they become less, as they decline in abundance, we find substitutes or we find efficiencies or ways to increase, to get more out of less. Um, and that ties in with resource efficiency, the notion that um, we have the ability to not overtax our environment by adapting. Now, I should hasten to say that we're going to look later in the semester at arguments that are much less optimistic and argue that, in fact, um, our recent improvements are not going to last, and that they are based upon a shaky foundation. I can show you this, for instance. This is one argument is that humans lived, population was very small and grew very, very slowly. Incomes were very, very low, and most people lived at just above subsistence, just enough to survive. And even at that, they lived lives that were only, between 25 and 40 years in length. So that for most of human existence, life was short, precarious, and only a tiny, tiny elite were able to live with some level of comfort. And in fact, even those medieval knights and nobility lived lives that were much less comfortable than or healthy than those that middle class Americans live today. But what really changed all that was that human endeavor was, ability to build economic abundance was really constrained by the fact that we were dependent mostly on muscle power, human muscles, the draft animals, oxen and horses, and as well as we just wind power in the form of sails for ships, or there were things like what do you call it, the wind water mills, but overall the amount of energy that was available for economic application was quite limited. What changed was the discovery of coal deposits, of oil, of natural gas, the development of the internal combustion engine, of steam engines, that allowed us to tap into a source of energy that could fuel an enormous economic expansion, so that humans were able not only to greatly multiply the number of people on Earth, but to rapidly increase the income and the material well-being of those humans. So you had both an enormous increase of per capita consumption, along with an enormous growth in the number of people that economies were able to support. And in order to do that, we depended greatly upon fossil fuel consumption. Now, the limiting factor then is, what are the long-term implications of burning that much fossil fuel? We've discovered that through climate change that fossil fuels are warming the earth in ways that are quite dangerous and are leading to massive species extinction, are leading to the rise of sea levels, the spread of disease, extreme weather events, the acidification of the oceans. And these could reverse much of the progress that's been made unless we find solutions very rapidly. And time is literally running out. We'll get into this more later in the semester, but there are ways to fuel our economies, modern economies, without fossil fuels. But even solar, wind, hydro, nuclear are at this point providing a tiny share of overall energy production, and we're still heavily dependent on fossil fuels. So that transition away from fossil fuels will have to occur very rapidly, and will likely mean that we cannot look forward to a future of unlimited, unending growth. And that then raises real questions about equity, because it's one thing if some people are rich and some people are poor, but the poor are getting better off because of growth. But if growth is no longer possible, then we have a question of whether the growing numbers of, you know, uh, growing populations in developing countries that are much poorer are going to put up with small portion of the world's population living in much greater abundance. All right, well, so a fairly optimistic picture on the one hand of how things have gotten better in the last couple centuries, but a warning about where things might be going in the future. Thanks.